mention a linkage now to our presentation right after me today is on sports. If you think of types of arts and types of cities, Alexis Pearson, who's in the front row, is our expert on Detroit. She's been a teacher in public school. She's lived there most of her life. She knows what's happening. She's talked to us about these niche nighttime activities, which she discovered, at least for us, talking about an alleyway, abandoned alley. People spray paint on the two walls of the alley. They bring in a boombox for music. They sell drinks, and they have a crowd standing around it on Friday and Saturday night, and maybe more than Friday and Saturday night. And they have white suburban young people who come in and participate in this, as well as the main African American local residents. Okay, well, where did that come from? This is now part of a booming street that goes across a whole lot of Detroit. There's lots of stuff going on. But where and why? Where did this begin? One of the biggest things, arguably, was a stadium. All right, with that introduction, why don't you guys come and tell us the stadium story? So you heard. I'll let you mention why. What was your, about your hypothesis and how you got into it. But I think you know how to tell the story best. Why don't you introduce yourselves and tell us what you're interested in here.
Hi, I'm Max.
And I'm Ahmed.
I'm a third year in the college studying economics.
Same.
Yeah. So essentially what we wanted to look at was the interactions between cities and sports teams when it comes to negotiating stadiums, what teams offer to the cities, and how they necessarily manage to get these financial incentives that are so massive. A lot of them in the order of magnitude of the near billions of dollars. Recently, I think 760.
We need the light to spin up too.
No.
It's the far right one, Max.
And that was our goal to look at. And what we ended up finding and ended up focusing a lot of the presentation on are the implications of globalization, specifically in the NBA, for how the development and especially the future development of these sports and the interactions with the cities.
So on why this thesis is important, on why this sort of exploration is important, there's a lot of layers to this sort of decision that a team has or that an organization has to choose one city over another. So by conducting this analysis, we were hoping to understand just how the decisions that may seem detached from the average person's life, somebody who doesn't think that their life is impacted by a sports stadium or by a team that is residing there, how that can impact them through urban policy.
And one of the things we immediately want to look at was globalization within the NBA. At large, growth for U.S. markets has been stagnating and slowing in recent years. And this has led teams to focus largely on international markets since the early to mid-2000s. And this is where they're seeing huge amounts of growth, upwards into the teens and early 20% of growth a year, compared to the U.S. market, which is in the low single digits. And this brings us to the question of how do these teams impact each other when it comes to two conflicting cultural norms? And this is perfectly seen in the Daryl Morey case of the Houston Rockets. For a little bit of background, here's kind of a general overview of how Chinese involvement in sports has been taking on. Some of these numbers: 750 million unique viewers for the 2018 basketball season. There are roughly the same recreational number of basketball players in China as there are people in the U.S.
You know that recreational basketball players as people in the U.S. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And this brings us to the perfect case study of the Houston Rockets. They're one of the most globalized teams as far as revenue streams. They're the second most popular team in China, largely because of the result of them having the first Chinese basketball player, Yao Ming. And they've made a massive investment into this space. Recently, they came up with these Chinese New Year basketball jerseys, and they've been bringing this through tours in China, and it's led to them being the second most popular team in the NBA. And Daryl Morey. No worries. So this led to Daryl Morey recently tweeting this image fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong, and as a response, China completely removed Houston Rockets material and essentially banned them from being shown on their TV network. And this led to massive controversy. You have a team who's between 15 and 20% of the revenue estimated is from China, is now dealing with one of their higher-ups, who's Daryl Morey, general manager, believing that the Chinese government is right now doing something awful and publicizing it. And this led to huge controversy. The NBA has largely been very strong in there and being supportive for free speech amongst their players. They've differed from the NBA in that dramatically. And now you see the Houston Rockets possibly seeing around 10 to 15% revenue loss all in 1 year from a single tweet. And this kind of brought us to the idea of these teams with more diversified revenue are now facing diversified populations and diversified morals. And they're no longer answering specifically to the city that they reside in, but now to different cultures with completely different values. And that was one of the things that we wanted to specifically analyze when going forward about how they interact in their culture.
So just like beyond the NBA as well, the NFL is also trying to expand internationally, trying to take on the sort of trend of globalization.
That means football.
So this past year they had 4 neutral site games, which basically means like there's no home team, they're playing in another market. So they had 4 games in London and they had 1 in Mexico City, which was last week. And through a partnership with Tencent that they had since 2017, that's going to be renewing next year, the NFL has 3 primetime games and 1 other game from their weekly slate broadcasted in China. And I mean, just in terms of having a primetime game, having a favorable location with the local market could assist you in that. So we see this with sort of the Seattle Seahawks, for example. They have a really strong fan base, really strong local market for their team. And as a result, they've had 4 or more primetime games over the past 7 years, which is a lot. Just some teams have very, very few. So in relation to that, in 2018, the Seahawks QB Russell Wilson went to various events and meet and greets as sort of a promotional thing, and this was organized by Alibaba in China. And the NFL owners, as of right now, are hoping to get a game to be played in China by around 2020. But it's had a couple hurdles, and they haven't really had the fandom before now, so they feel pretty comfortable that 2020 might be a safe timeline to shoot for. And this is just a picture of Tom Brady and a promotional run for the NFL as well. He's fluent in Mandarin, so they kind of ship him out there a lot and try to get him to get a lot of fans, excited about the NFL. He went there with Under Armour in the NFL, and also something that's pretty interesting is that in China, Tom Brady actually has his own little TV show where it's like a 15-minute spot for about an 8-month period that he had, where he was just like pretty much being Tom Brady. The Tom Brady China Show is what that show is called. And so, like as sort of mentioned before with the Seahawks, right? When we think about markets, having a certain location really impacts the team's merchandise and ticket sales. A really good example of this is the LA Chargers, who were previously located in San Diego. Their problem was that they wanted to have a new stadium, but as a result, the owner did not want to pay for the entire cost of that stadium. So you would appeal to taxpayers and hopefully have them pay for some big portion of it. The taxpayers of San Diego, majority voted them down and rejected that proposal. And Andrew Zimbalist and Roger Noah, both are economists that write for a institution named Brookings. They stated that in reality, sports has little effect on regional net exports, and sports facilities don't attract tourists or new industry.
So you see that this is controversial, but go ahead.
Yeah. And upon being rejected, so Dean Spanos, the owner of the Chargers, he took them from San Diego to LA, where they average a league worst 25,000 attendees at their games. They're in a very limited stadium because they don't have a new stadium built yet because, the previous one expired in San Diego and they left. And the LA market has not accepted the Chargers in any way. Like, the Chargers are very much back page news in LA. The Rams, on the other hand, moved at the same time in 2017, and they averaged 71,000 attendees. And a lot of this could be accounted for just by the fact of legacy in LA. And that speaks to the idea that sometimes teams can just choose the marketing correctly. And On one more thing, the leadership. When we think about the role of leadership, this could be best illustrated by the Raiders. They haven't moved yet, but they are planning to move from Oakland to Las Vegas. They're currently still playing in Oakland. And Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf would not support using public funds on a $900 million stadium because they were still paying off the previous stadium, which had outstanding balance for the city to take on of $80 million. So in came Las Vegas pretty much, and Las Vegas decided that they would pay $750 million of taxpayer dollars to build a $2.6 billion stadium, and this would be taken out of the hotel tax, which is something that's used towards like education and transportation. And Stanford economist Roger Noll once again said, worst deal he's ever seen. But this presence of a local team in combination with a growing gambling scene, a growing sports betting scene, which is becoming a lot more normalized and legalized, could be something that's different and may be different than what the original thesis is, but it's yet to be determined.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that a lot of these sports teams come and they offer as part of their pitch is that they really do relate with the art of the scene. And this is kind of one of the things that we see with LeBron coming to LA. When he came, there was paintings about him, and a lot of times it's just through some inspiration of art. And one of the major things that these sports teams sell is this kind of idea of improving the scene through artistic effects. Recently, what we've seen is with the Dallas Cowboys, they asked for a tremendous budget to build a stadium under the guise that it would act as a museum and also be a tourist attraction and an art centerpiece for the city. And through that, they were able to get to one of the most expensive stadiums at the time, right around $2 billion, mostly funded by the government. And this kind of relates in the globalization sense because Rosentraub has one of the most famous authors, prolific authors about the impacts of sports in the scenes, has completely attacked the idea of public funds being used for stadiums. The economic incentives are dramatically misaligned, with the cities, in almost every single case, losing tremendously. And kind of through that conclusion, one of the things that the new teams are doing, and what we'll see with globalization, is they won't care as much, and this is kind of our conclusion, that they will be less inclined to actually value the city for what it is and just look at the financial incentives because of the growing market in China. And kind of one of the interesting things, the two most popular basketball teams in the NBA are, for China, are the Warriors and the Houston Rockets. The Warriors is largely a locational base. 21.5% of their population is of San Francisco is Chinese American, and naturally that has kind of caused a divide where more people are inclined to support the Warriors just because of the large Chinese connection. On the other hand, the Houston Rockets have a very negligible Chinese population, and the real reason why they've actually had such a strong base is largely because of their action of drafting Yao Ming in 2001, and then expanding their actual connection there. And what we'll see, and what we expect to see, is that because of the impact of globalization, you'll see teams valuing the cities that they're actually bidding for at a lot less than more than the check that they're being offered. And I think that's one of the interesting things that we saw through our research was when the revenue stream diversifies, the tide of the community becomes a lot lower, and consequently, it even lowers the incentives of cities to offer them money.
Okay, so we have a couple of minutes of questions and discussion. Maybe flip the light switch. And folks, what do you say? Comments, suggestions? There's a little more for everybody. This is new, controversial findings.
All right, thank you guys.
Did you find that you said that there was like public signs or arts depicting the Los Angeles athletes?
Yeah.
Did you find that those depictions were more present in some neighborhoods versus others?
I'm sure it's very likely to find that. LA has a huge mural culture, and I think that's probably largely the reason why that they've made it for LeBron. They've actually made it for other athletes for lower profile also. I think it's definitely true that it was very locationally based on the amount of public art for incoming athletes.
Yeah, I thought that I thought that the discussion of like the Rams and Chargers was pretty interesting. I think you guys like hit the nail on the head with the Rams being like the storied franchise in LA. Just out of curiosity, do you guys know if the Chargers ever tried to like make a bid to play at either the Rose Bowl or the Coliseum? Because like the Rams' attendance, I think, might be largely a function of the fact that they actually play at like USC's stadium, where the capacity is massive relative to like. I'm curious as to how like their attendance numbers might fluctuate if they were to play at like the Rose Bowl or something like that.
Yeah, so like in terms of the Chargers right now play in the soccer stadium for I think like the LA Galaxy or something like that. So just in terms of capacity, they don't really have that much. But even considering their like restricted capacity, they don't have a lot of home fans that even show up to their games. Like if you watch any Chargers game, you're gonna always hear the crowd more or less cheering for the other team. Like they had a game recently where the Pittsburgh Steelers were there, and the announcer ended up playing the Pittsburgh Steelers music for like their theme song, where you're the home team but you're not really the home team. And I believe in a year or two, the Chargers and the Rams are actually moving into a joint project together, which is going to be like the most expensive stadium ever. And so that move is a bit, concerning because you don't really know whether or not the Chargers are going to be able to charge the same amount for their tickets as with the Rams. But in terms of bringing people into just filling up the stadium, I think that once the Chargers are moving into a stadium with the Rams, where you have a much higher capacity, they'll probably be able to fill that up just in terms of the NFL fandom in the area. But it wouldn't be, translating into merchandise sales, more or less ticket sales.
That kind of brought another one of our critiques. A lot of these conversations with cities are through back channels. There are public forums, but the majority of the actual negotiation occurs behind closed doors. I think that's one of the big limitations for the taxpayer when they're making the decision, is you don't actually see what goes through the process. And a lot of these teams, and we see with Amazon also, they hire a group of consultants who come in and they do the negotiations and essentially figure out how much the city's willing to pay, and that way almost get the most out of the taxpayer as possible.
So, to clarify the conclusion, it was like globalization leads to less community involvement.
So we think it's like the team loses such a strong obligation to really comply with the standards and values of the actual community that it physically resides in, largely because the owners of these teams have a fiduciary duty to do its best for what they believe the ownership is, and a lot of that to them is focusing on the revenue streams that are growing the fastest. And that's kind of what we see, and what we expect to see is that loses their ties to the community that gives them the funding.
So then if like a team being relocated in a certain place, like when LeBron joined the Lakers and then there's like increased art in that community, wouldn't that like kind of counteract the effect if it was like being more publicized?
Yeah, I think it could. One thing that we kind of consider is it's hard to value a mural at like $900 million. But I do think that there are community implications of just having these high-profile players, high-profile teams in certain cities.
So you were saying that like the reason you thought that when China liked the Warriors was because of the large Asian American population in San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, because like the Warriors have also been like really good for a long time, so I was wondering sort of how you like decided to look at that versus.
Yeah. So
like,
one of the
how
things.
are they doing like this year in China? Because they're not doing very hot.
So unfortunately, we don't have 2019 statistics yet. But what we did see was in 2012 they did something similar, and the Warriors were actually behind the Rockets, but it was a very close difference. So that's kind of how we determined that it was probably largely because of the 21.5% Chinese American population.
Also, the fact that like the Rockets are like pretty much banned now, so they just kind of got rid of the second biggest team in China. It might shift a little bit more of the viewership over to the Warriors, just on the only option really being there, whereas the more popular option.
Do you think that in the future you'll see a lot less like small market teams? But because I'm thinking about it as well, but then it seems like at some point you can only have like LA can't hold every single team, like in the NFL or NBA. So I'm curious what you guys think is how this will play out going forward.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting question. there's a lot of federal policy recently that's looking at limiting and banning the amount of money that cities can offer sports teams. I think if that goes through, it's obviously going to really change the landscape. I also think, specifically in LA, there's been a huge pushback from the taxpayer. I mean, I think it's very difficult to justify spending money for a third sports stadium. And I think it's probably going to shape it mostly. And then once these big cities who are largely liberal voting population really kind of have a revolt against it, because I think it's very difficult to justify it, especially when you have people in LA with such a large homeless problem justifying it like $900 million stadium. So I think that's largely going to change the space. Is going to be the political atmosphere.
Okay, how about a little more general discussion? Alexis, anything you want to say about Detroit and the stadium there?
Yeah, this whole time I've been like thinking about, because Detroit's got a new stadium that is like now holding the NBA team and the NHL team, so it's a dual stadium, and it's like a mixed use stadium, so it has like restaurants and stores and apartments and stuff attached to it. But I don't know if it was like funded by the city or if it was, because it was a very large like private like company who was doing it. So I don't really know that aspect of it, but I was thinking about it in comparison to what you were talking about, like how it brings in revenue. Because the big thing in Detroit was that now all of the sports teams are back in the city and they're like downtown, and so it was like this grand like scheme by the government to be like, we brought all this sports teams back to the city. And so like it was interesting to hear how you were saying like, but
Where
there
have they
is
been?
one of them, like the hockey team was downtown, but it was in a very dilapidated like stadium that had been there for years. And then the Pistons, who are the basketball team, they were out in like the suburbs, which is like an hour and a half away from the city. So they brought it all back to like the city center. And yeah, the argument was that it was for economic development. So it was interesting to hear you say, but it doesn't actually do anything. I was like, oh, okay.
Yes, I think like let's say like the general stadium, it typically costs around an order of magnitude of $500 million. The vast majority of which typically comes from the taxpayer. And what we see is it's usually justified through economic development, growth, things of that sort. But it's very hard to justify it when cities typically only collect sales, sales tax, and other large tax on hotels. But when it actually comes to the venue usage, and this is one of the things that Rosentraub really talks about, which surprised us in his book, Major League Losers, was that very little of the probability for the actual stadium being hosted as a venue, let's say like concerts and things of that sort, actually trickles down to the city. When it comes to the usage of it, the rental usage, it typically is very high cost, so the margins are very low, and of that money, I think it's like when it comes to percent-wise, in the single digits of the actual revenue comes back to the city. So it makes it almost impossible for them to actually recoup any of their money through it.
Okay, so this is what I want to talk about. That is, the USC economists, if they're given what you presented, I'll be interested if you present this in some economic courses and see what reactions you get. But in general, the guys who are closest to working on this say they won't work on this kind of problem because it's too qualitative. You've got to weight individual cases too heavily, and the normal tools and methods of econometrics don't apply, so they won't touch it. And I've been in several sessions when we've had this kind of discussion. Second, there are people, say at Stanford, you quoted a couple of times, and Mark Rosentraub was at Michigan, who's I'm not sure if he's a political scientist, public policy associate. That he's not an economist, but basically, the people who do these cost-benefit analyses are usually consulting firms, so-called. And what they do is, and I've been involved in lots of big projects such as trying to bring the Olympics to Chicago or trying to bring another stadium, etc. And so you can have costs and then benefits, and then so this may be, X million dollars, this may be Y $1 million, but the point is, if you have A, B, C, D, A, B, or say D, E, F, G, the great majority of them, which is what touched off my comment, which inspired these guys, and I'm impressed that you went out and really pursued this, was that the great majority of the studies that Rosentraub is citing that Larry Bennett did on Chicago for the all the bars and restaurants just south of the Cubs Stadium are very, very local. And it was when this huge Chinese guy was hired that I said to myself, hey, this is going to change all of these. And so I went to meetings with our Chicago people like Larry Bennett and people who were doing books on stadiums, and I said, look, how about the Chinese market? These guys are not, that is Larry Bennett and others generally work on 2 zip codes. They don't talk about the Chicago suburbs. They don't talk about viewership in California. China? No, that is, so the point is you found 10, 20% of the revenues may be coming from China, which is omitted in the benefits coming into, okay, so the question is who gets the benefits? So now you're talking about more subtle things. Benefit to whom more precisely? If it goes to the team and to the owner, does it go to the players? Part of it. We don't know exactly how much. Part of it is profit, but part of it is going to be, will also be the players. If the players get the money, what will they do with it? Will they spend it locally? Will they spend it all in China? Or some of it in the U.S. or some of it in that is, it's complicated and nobody knows. Is the simple answer. But the point is, it's a lot of money, and the point of your presentation is, I think that the strong point which you can make is, and based on that is, rather than just giving the conclusions of the economists at Stanford and Rosentraub, say what is their methodology, and their methodology is they say nothing about international markets and fees, and you're adding in your presentation 10-20%, which is far more than most of the factors which the other people are talking about. Second, if one begins to add more things like that, then one can ask questions like, how much is it the Chinese population of San Francisco compared to one player? I mean, this is your, I mean, clearly you can see, this is your intuitive judgment. And maybe 5 other people have written that, but nobody knows. That is, you need more data to try to assess the causal impact of these complicated, so I would say rather than going out on a limb, especially if you're in economics here, I would show the normal model. Show the normal models are very, very local. They say nothing. They don't. I mean, you came up with these numbers, and initially we went through about 6 exchanges in the last 2 weeks. Initially you cited USA Today, and I said, look, don't say USA Today. So you dug a little more. You found Nielsen NBA, but does Nielsen have the money from the Chinese?
Yeah, we didn't look into that.
So I don't think so. See, Nielsen normally measures television viewership. Yeah. That's their forte. They don't look at the contracts of the deals. And so I'd say go to the reference librarian at the USC, ask where can you try to find something like the Securities and Exchange Commission reports of the sports teams, because they have to tell this to the IRS. At least they can't. We can't know everything, but we probably can tell the 10 or the 20% and probably get it over time.
Yeah.
So dig a little more, and that is, I think you've got a really hot topic, but you've got to, you hear what I said. You said that is, you've got a mixture of where and how you're really innovating, and you can be on stronger ground if you don't go out quite so far on a limb, and really stress what is original, new, and how your numbers can totally transform the past work of people like Rosentraub or the guy instead. That is, most of the economists, I shouldn't say economists, most of the Chicago economists, I'd say most of the smart economists just won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. But the people who do generally say you should not subsidize the sports teams, because look at how much revenue the city government is getting from the bars on
in White Sox Park and the Cubs Stadium, and either the stadium and then the bars nearby. But that ignores, for instance, people who live in the suburbs of Detroit, who come to downtown Detroit, who stay on and who buy drinks, who shop, who may spend the afternoon, Saturday afternoon, and then get to the game, then go to dinner, then go back to the suburbs. That is omitted from many of these analyses. So the huge factor you just mentioned, the teams, bringing the teams back from the suburbs, or a major team back from the suburbs to downtown Detroit, that's a huge symbolic policy, which may be much more important than that is, we don't know without more comparative work. And as we get into the specifics of arts and sports and entertainment, we get into complications of how to do them. We need Professor Kiji and her. We have 5 teams that are working in China to try to understand these things more precisely. But a lot of this is work in progress, and as you see, it's hard to get good data. And if you get good data on one thing, you cannot get data on maybe 15 other things that you also need. So I would say, stress looking at what the best studies have done, and how weak they in fact are, and how they don't include some very important things, that is, I bet most of those studies don't say a word about Chinese viewership, and that is Chinese viewership in San Francisco, as you suggested.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. So, cheers. Creative stuff. Lots of potential in starting a whole new line of research in this area. So, congratulations. And second and third year students in the college, these are not MA, PhD students. That's all the more kudos to you. Okay. So what you've seen here with Yasmin Arakan talking about in her MA, basically, which she was summarizing, is that people are working on these new issues with a variety of methodologies. I mean, so she gave you a fair amount of the case study side of Theaster Gates of one artist. At the same time that she's also, we didn't have time to go into, but trying to find ways to do this systematically. How can you control? So if you had, if you get the percentage of viewers, that is, there's another woman who did a BA here in sociology, just to give you a wild, interesting idea, which she again came up in discussions we had. She found little bits of it and pieces. We then talked about it. She wanted to study business decisions in LA and where and how retail might grow or not. She had a full-time job at the end of her third year in the college in Orange County. She went out to Orange County from Pasadena. So she had commuted across LA. But she worked full-time for several months for a consulting firm doing studies like what we've seen here. Where and why should a firm locate? And they did these studies for national firms as well as for cities. So they did studies for Miami, for Miami, for Baltimore, I think. So she wrote reports based on the data which she felt. I shouldn't say she felt. She was told by the consulting firm, the city should want and the company should want. So she said, well, how about things like the arts? No, don't try to talk about that. So she started to innovate a little bit, and then she talked about how she might have some new ideas in her BA, and they said, well, we'll be interested in the BA when you finish. That is, she saw up close the quality and the lack of quality, the lack of innovativeness of people doing this professionally and selling these kinds of reports. Okay, in her BA, she was looking for ways of talking to people in cafes in different neighborhoods of LA. And her interesting idea, and she didn't even start with this, but we got a second student to work with her, and the two of them together were reading the LA Times every day, looking for things about the arts, walking around, etc. Question: if you have a cafe and you have on an adjacent street a mural, as you heard described in Detroit, how much value does the mural add? Okay, that was and so why ask that question? Because we found a CBS 1-hour documentary claiming that artwork, original artwork, next to a local facility, even in low-income neighborhoods, and they had about 30 minutes on a low-income neighborhood in Miami, a very low-income neighborhood, led people would come into the low-income neighborhood and they'd shop a little bit because the murals were so dramatic and they were original artwork. The incomes went up and the retail sales went up. I'm not sure if it was incomes. At least the retail sales went up in this low-income neighborhood. This is CBS News. This is not econometrics, but it's hints in the same direction as you have here. Second, there's a firm in Brooklyn, a leading arts center these days, which built up a national network of 100 of artists in 100 cities that will do original paintings if you hire them to do so. And there are more and more private companies, people selling milk, shoes, perfume, baskets, any kind of thing, clothes, and they're hiring artists in Kansas City or Wichita and so forth to do paintings on their building. So this was inspired in part by there's one building in the LA Arts District, which is just a pink box. That is, most of LA is just white stucco with a couple of lights at night and maybe a little bit of green plant. But the architecture of LA is like that. So what they changed was to paint the building pink. And then right next to it they had some mural. Huge numbers is that. Then the way the individual firms, the way that this is coming out, a new data source. If you look on the internet, social media is a fantastic potential research source, because you could look at the number of people who then, here's the one bottom line driver. People go to a cafe or they go shopping in the pink store, then they go outside and they take a picture of themselves or their friend next to the mural and to the store and post it, here's the bottom line, on Instagram and say, hey, we just had a great coffee in an interesting place, come and visit. Millions of people, hundreds of millions of people are advertising shops and shopping at no cost to, and more genuine, because it is not advertising. They're telling their friends, here's something we did which you would enjoy. Okay, question, does that make any difference? That's what she's now doing an MA in Cambridge, England, and she's studying these kinds of issues at a higher statistical modeling level than she did in her BA. Here in sociology, she's going on. She's in part of an economics program at Cambridge. Okay, so you can advance the research, and this, as I say, these ideas are completely new dynamics. Nobody talked about them before, but these are concrete examples of how one could show an impact of the arts on high, middle, low income, black, white, Mexican, whatever, Chinese, and see where and how much these impacts may or may not have, may or may not be, how large. So this is mostly for the future, but I'm just giving you some examples of people who are coming up with new, unusual mechanisms, and trying to document them in a series. In Cambridge, one thing which she wants to add to her MA is the reputation of the neighborhood and the reputation of the city. okay, how much does the reputation of Detroit go up if it has a sports team in downtown and people are driving to it? How much does that transform not just the revenues from the restaurants, but also people saying, yeah, Detroit's an okay place to go to for shopping and for having a good time. That did not happen. You didn't hear that read the books by even, my pal, my colleague, my competitor occasionally, Ed Glazer at Harvard. He has a book called The Triumph of the Cities. 1/3 of the book is just trashing Detroit. So, there are cities all doing this, but nothing could be worse than Detroit. He just says that in almost every chapter, what Detroit is wrong and what it's doing, and it's always a disaster. And he's ignoring the little bits of transformation which are going on. And there was one guy who did a BA with me on Detroit, which was a BA. It was 240 pages in the first draft. He said, got to cut it back a bit, so it's not the full amount, but he studied the role of artists in the renovation of Detroit, and it was a phenomenal study. He worked on it for a year and a half. Okay, so let's turn a little bit to some of the readings in this area. We're not going to go over them in detail, but just to give you the flavor of how some of this fits together. Two readings which are near the end of the. Let me go through the readings here. This says economic development impacts. The standard background in sociology was articulated. I mentioned earlier the class politics model of Bourdieu, Paul DiMaggio. More specifically, Urban was the book by John Logan and Harvey Mullage. And it's here not because it's a good book, it's a bad book, I would say. But it's here because it's had impact, and people who want to read this story say developers and capitalism are what are destroying our cities. And they're looking for greedy money for themselves, and they're hurting the other people. Okay. They published it in 1987. Both of them within 15 years after they published it, both of them have been publishing things which say the book was wrong. And Mullage, in his very careful case studies of Southern California, Logan, in 2 studies, a national comparative study and then a review of the case studies, basically said the key central hypothesis would that the city government would raise the money, use taxpayers' money, help development, help the developers make more money, which is what you get in part in the discussions of the stadiums, was a poor analysis because it left out too many other things and too many other dynamics. The second one, it's on one of the papers of Logan is listed as extra. Logan with John Rachel Bridges, Whaley, and Kyle Crowder, the character and consequences of growth regimes, an assessment of 20 years of research, Urban Affairs Review. Okay, Edward Getz was, I mentioned briefly before, he worked with Dianne Feinstein administration on what, and I talked about his survey. What he has in this paper, and what made him more famous in part, was what he called type 2 policies, which were things which could be linked to an affluent developer and development project, which could, and often required by the city. Harold Washington did a certain amount of this, Detroit did a certain amount of this, New York was negotiating this with Amazon when the Amazon people quit. That is, how much might a new, affluent, visible, big developer transfer to low-income persons locally? And that is continually being negotiated in ways that illustrate, this was not done visibly in most places 30, 40 years ago. It is now done in some areas. The Sharon Zukin book called Global Cities, Local Streets, Everyday Diversity from New York to Shanghai, makes a Hollywoodization McDonaldization kind of argument that you get in detail where they studied Amsterdam, Shanghai, and New York, the same kind of retail everywhere. That Fifth Avenue, or at least chunks of Fifth Avenue they looked at, looked very similar to Shanghai and looked very similar in Amsterdam. They have the same names of some of the same brands, was basically what they would come up with. How did they choose the streets? They don't say. They just, I'll leave you with that. Think about just that. I mean, if you go to a different street in any of these cities, you get very different results. If you go to Harlem, if you go to far out in Brooklyn, etc. I'll just mention one more feeding into this. Gordon Douglas was a TA in this course, and he did his PhD, and he's published it as a book, and this is a paper adapted from that. And he created the term do-it-yourself urban design, the social practice of informal improvement through unauthorized alteration. And one example was if you live nearby a sidewalk and there's water flooding across the sidewalk, you can build a little bridge yourself. That is, I mean, what most people do will complain. So, oh, the city doesn't do a good job. Or you can call the city, or you can send a letter to the city government. Can you please fix the leak in front of my house? And that's what 90% of people do. But he studies the 10% of people who build a little bridge themselves, and they put it down, and they walk over the bridge. I mean, that's a trivial, small example, and he's got more things. I mean, they even put in new stop signs.
What's his name?
Gordon C.C. Douglas on page 8 of the syllabus. He has a great website, which I have here, and a book which has his title. He came back and he gave a presentation on his book in this class maybe two or 3 years ago. But you can see him. He gives a great presentation on the videos, which where he summarizes this stuff. So the point is, what these examples, even Logan and Molich themselves, they abandon this older theory, and the new younger people like Gordon Douglas and the guys who just presented today, we're looking for new dynamics, how the older processes are too simple. In a sense, in the next 20, 30 years, people won't throw these things out, but they may make them more coherent, more rigorous, try to build in sharper rationales. And I talked about how when we work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, when you've got staffs with PhDs in the U.S. working for the U.S. Congress, they hit you with hard questions, and so the level of analysis is getting higher and higher in all of this, all these fields. Okay, questions, comments on any of this? Suggestions. Say, I'm thinking about doing or maybe I could do a BA on this, or I could advise, or if you're going to work for a mayor, and the mayors are looking for smart young people like you, seriously, and we had one guy who over here a couple of days ago talked about working for the mayor of Louisville, Kentucky. Mayor's offices are a fascinating place to work. The smaller the city, the more likely you can get closer to the mayor. If you get to, you go to New York, Chicago, you're not going to be close to the mayor. You can be part of see the team at work, but if you want to be closer to an actual mayor and that is, if you go in and say, I'm thinking about doing a BA, can I interview you please? They're going to say, yeah, I'll give you 45 seconds. If you say, I'd like to volunteer to work in your office for the summer, how can I help? But I also need to do a BA, if that would be okay. Would you like me to work in your office? Many will say, some will say in Chicago, sorry, we do things I don't think we want you here for. Clientelism. Those folks don't want it written up. But 2/3 of Chicago council members will say, yes, we'd love to have you come. And you will learn more doing that than if you try to say, talk to me on my terms. Especially if you're, that is, as I think you know by now, you come from the USC, you talk to most people in Chicago, and they're going to say, you're a rich out-of-town kid, and you're spoiled, and I don't want to talk to you. So you've got that reputation to overcome, and you've got to lean over backwards. If you're a faculty member as well, you've got to lean over backwards and not act that way. Okay. More suggestions or questions on any of this? Yes.
You mentioned before that the coffee shop example of like original artwork would bring in more outsiders to the neighborhood. Is it also would bring more locals to that coffee shop? And would you say that like even without the outsiders there would be more, the neighborhood would be more prosperous because of the art? Or do you need outsiders?
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's a big question. But then more specifically, the hypothesis, and I'll tell you this, is that I think it's in the BA. I mean, the hypothesis, which Juliet Lee's her name, very talented. What Juliet had was the hypothesis that the individual shop owners would spend the money because it would get more business for their individual shop. Self-interest, economic, narrowly defined. She interviewed people, and people coming to especially in the LA Arts District, where you had lots of cafes and then art galleries and so forth, and then people taking more photographs. She asked them, "Why did you come here?" And she expected, and then she interviewed the business leaders. Why did you help to get the artists to draw this? And she expected people to say, because it would bring more business, and I wanted to have more profit for my coffee shop or something like that. Nobody said that. Nobody. All of her interviews, and this was an ethnographic study, so it's a small number of cases, but nevertheless, everybody said they were coming to the LA Arts District, and they admired, and they were taking pictures, and the owners said, I don't care about my position individually. What I care about, and the reason we want these murals and these activities, is the whole arts district then will get a more visible, good reputation, and people will come in general. But it was not that is the Logan and Molich very narrow, crude self-interest, as I think I've said in this class. What did Marx himself call that motivation?